Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore the indigenous contribution to eco-psychology. With me is Dr. Glenn Aparicio Parry, who is the author of Original Thinking, a Radical Revisioning of Time, Humanity, and Nature. He is also the director of the Circle for Original Thinking based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's an honor to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And, you began your work as a student of my old good friend and your dear colleague, Danny Alford Moonhawk, as he was known, a student of Native American languages, and the person who began to organize meetings of Native American elders with theoretical physicists, with quantum physicists, to see what they have to say to each other.
Yeah, well, Moonhawk was very important to him in his life, those gatherings. Mm-hmm. He was invited by his mentor, which was Sagesh Youngblood Henderson, who was head of the Law Center in Saskatoon. And Sagesh, he came to the class that Moonhawk was teaching us in 1983 on anthropological linguistics. And then it was in 1992 that Leroy Little Bear and David Peed brought together this gathering, and Moonhawk was invited. Moonhawk was an important part, and there were other linguists too. They were considered an important kind of translator, really, between the quantum physicists and the indigenous elders. Mm-hmm. And it really meant a lot to Moonhawk. It touched his heart. And then he was visiting me after I had started the Seed Institute in 1996.
In Albuquerque.
Yes. And we were sitting outside in my back porch looking at the Sandia Mountains, and he was smoking his pipe, as he often did. Mm-hmm. And out came the pipe dream. And Moonhawk said, "Glenn, why don't we bring the dialogues to Albuquerque?" Mm-hmm. And I instantly agreed, and, then we talked a little bit about, if we get a grant or not a grant. I said, well, it doesn't matter. Let's invite an outer circle, because it's a principle of quantum physics. The outer circle or the observer affects the observed. Mm-hmm. So we brought an outer circle together with that inner circle. And there was an opening to the east of both circles, with the idea being that thought moves through the room and infuse the dialogue. And dialogue just... Wow, I was so happy that Moonhawk suggested that, because it turned out that completely shifted my life. Mm-hmm. And it was the reason why the book, Original Thinking, was given birth. We
should probably make clear for our viewers right at the outset that you were not of Native American ancestry.
I am not, but I am tribal. Uh-huh. So, my father's mother's side, Basque. So really the Basque are indigenous from Europe. My father's side is Aragon Spanish. My mother's side is Jewish, and
it's a tribal culture.
It's a tribal culture, yes. Right. So, my father made his way. The story is actually my grandmother, the Basque grandmother. She walked 300 miles and got to Barcelona. She got a job as a chef's attendant. And when that chef moved to New York City, she was thought of highly enough, so the chef took her with him. And that's how my father ended up getting to New York City.
Mm-hmm. Well, I interviewed Moonhawk when he was alive. He was a lovely man, a good friend of mine. Yeah. And he talked about how what struck him about the languages of the Native Americans and what they seemed to have in common with the quantum physicists during these dialogues was the notion of process. That in the English language we have many nouns, but in Native languages almost everything is a verb.
That's right. That's right. And one of the reasons why Leroy was interested in approaching David Bohm was because of that. He noticed that Bohm had actually realized that the English language was not equal, not up to the task of describing the quantum realm, which was all process and relationship.
We're talking about one of the great quantum physicists, David Bohm.
Yes.
Who participated in these dialogues.
Yes, as the junior colleague of Einstein. And so Bohm, wanted to create his own language. And he called it the Rio mode, or actually not a language, but a mode of English, after the Greek, R-H-E-O, Rio. And it was basically like adding ing to the end of everything. And that made, we were just, you verb everything. And Leroy used to poke fun and do that in the dialogues. He would say, okay, Jeff, you're going to be Jeffing now, and you're going to be Glenning, and everybody was verbing themselves, just like Bucky Fuller used to talk about, I am not a noun, I seem to be a verb.
Yes.
So we did that, and we understood that, I think, in this dialogue circle, which was so wonderful.
Let's talk about time. To begin with. I love your story about how we normally think of time as the future being ahead of us and the past being behind us, and yet the Native American elders with whom you worked saw it just the opposite.
Well, I learned from Moonhawk that the ancient Greeks, we don't have to go to indigenous culture right away. So for the ancient Greeks, the past was ahead of them because it had already manifested. Yeah. And so where they had eyes to see, the future was behind them, which was enveloping them from behind. It's not really a line, but the future was all behind. A little like Carlos Castaneda talks about death stalking us from behind. So yes, the future is manifesting through us. So the ancient Greeks are very similar to today's Maori, who talk in the same way, talking about it's the past that's in front of them where it's already manifest and the future is behind. And
even talking about front and back, I suppose,
it's not
normally presupposes linear thinking. And yet indigenous people they don't think linearly the way we do, like a straight line. They don't see time as a straight line.
That's right. Well, I'll just come out and say it. I said in my view, it's correct. Linear time is a complete illusion, which Einstein understood. He would just say it's just, albeit it's a very persistent illusion. Yeah. But it's a total illusion. Time does not happen as a line. So why are we so addicted to that? That's kind of the things that I write about in the book, Original Thinking. And a lot of it is it's not just convention. Some of it has been come about because of all kinds of means in the culture that reinforce that. One of them is in art, is in linear perspective in art. So that happened exactly 600 years ago, 1415. Brunelleschi, pokes a hole in a painting. He puts a mirror behind it, and he has the best of intent. He wants to paint the world as God saw the world. He wants to create a 3D illusion on a 2D canvas. And all he's done is create an illusion. Because we really have our view of the world could be immersive. We have two moving and very watery eyes. And that's how we really are perceiving the world. And yet, if you think about linear perspective, it's a view from one stationary eye, and it projects these lines onto the future. And that's what you're talking about. That's why we started to believe that the future was ahead of us. And then, Jeff, we took the extra step. If the future is ahead of us, now we're going to try to predict and control it. And that's really the advent of Western science that really came about in the Renaissance. It's also the advent even of the simplest things, just like a clock, because before then we really weren't using clocks. We were using astrolabes and we were using sundials, but we kept moving and, we keep moving toward further and further abstraction from the natural world to describe time. We've made time our own. We've created this complete fiction, time, and we're now living our life by it.
We're dominated by it, you might say.
We're all colonized by time. Particularly, it's not like we just colonized indigenous people. We colonized ourselves first. And that's the problem.
Well, when you talk about perspective in art, one of the things that perspective, I suppose, reinforces is the idea that I am separate from the rest of the world. And I suppose if we were to get to the very fundamental ground of indigenous thinking around the world and mystical thinking in every culture around the world, it's that this separation is an illusion. We are connected with everything.
That's right. Oh, he couldn't said it better. So it's very ironic that what comes after, in the Renaissance is the Enlightenment, and then we start to describe people that are enlightened as having the penetrating rational thought that penetrates the world. When, of course, if you're talking to a Vedic sage or something, someone from India, we're talking about enlightenment completely differently, just like you spoke of, as enlightenment breaking those veils of illusion that pretend that we're separate from the world. Mm-hmm. We become interconnected with everything, and that's really more enlightenment.
Well, since you've brought up the notion of the Vedas, and since I introduced our program as having to do with indigenous thought, one of the points you seem to be making is that there is a commonality, not only amongst the different indigenous people, but amongst indigenous people around the world. The animistic and shamanistic worldviews that they hold is in many ways corresponds with and is sympathetic with the mystical viewpoints of Asian religions, for example.
Yes. I mean, we really truly are interconnected with everything. We couldn't exist without the trees that are giving out the breath of life that we're giving back to them in a sacred circle. We couldn't exist without the sun that's giving us light, life, and energy. We could not exist without the elements, So this is something indigenous people are talking about, but I think it's very well understood in ancient Greek culture, in our own traditions. We used to understand that the air wasn't empty. The air was aware. The air was pneuma. The air was ruach. The air was prana. Whatever word you use.
These are all words for spirit.
Life, energy.
And when you say life, I think you are really speaking about consciousness itself.
Yes.
Everything is alive. Everything is conscious. Everything is in relationship with us.
Yes. So when the Buddha talking about thought and consciousness arising, that is true. The Western worldview that went down the road, and you've investigated all this stuff in your, over the course of many, many decades. But when in the West, when we tried to pinpoint the arrival of consciousness, when did consciousness come in? Some epiphenomenon of brain or something, some more evolved, complex critters. That's kind of the wrong path, I would say, because it's always there.
At every level.
Yeah. I mean, one of the dialogue questions Leroy Littlebear asked once was, how did the first awareness arise? And then, while we were dialoguing that later that day, it kind of slipped from first to original. How did the original awareness arise? And it made all the difference to me because first I start thinking of lines. I start thinking of linear. And that's, an obsession in Western culture. We're obsessed with when the universe began. Yeah. And really, does it really matter whether we're talking about, 14 billion years ago or whether we're talking about 6,000 years ago or...
Well, in the Western Bible... created by, some of the earliest of written languages. We say, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And I know the Catholic Church embraced the Big Bang Theory as being consistent with the biblical interpretation of creation. But there's another view, isn't there?
Well, there sure is, and I'm laughing now because I'm thinking of Paula Gunn Allen, one of my dear ancestors, but she was once talking about right with Brian Swim was at a dialogue circle. She was talking about, well, where I come from, God is a woman, and so I can't get behind this Big Bang Theory. It seems like a male ejaculatory fantasy, It's like kaboom, wow, orgasm, great, everything's moving out. But, what man would be satisfied with just one? He would come back. So, I mean, actually, there's a lot of physicists that are talking about not one big bang. They're talking about that may be part of this creation, but it happens multiple times.
The cosmos is much larger than just our 14 billion year old universe.
Well, I don't believe there's a beginning of the universe. I mean, Grandfather Leon Secatero said to me once, Glenn, I don't think I know the universe has always been here. And I really, he was always right. I mean, he died September 28th of the year 2008, and he told me exactly what was going to happen with the U.S. economy 2 days before he died. Mm-hmm. He said the whole economy is going to be reset. And it was, like 2-3 months later, the cover of Newsweek said, reset. Mm-hmm. He knew. And in fact, he was not the slightest bit arrogant, don't get me wrong, but he would say toward the end of his life that the word prophecy was not an adequate word because it implies some kind of guess or forecast, where if you know, and it's a very different thing.
I gather that if you know means that you're one with.
Something like that. I mean, I go to, and I know you can relate to this, I go often to dreams. They've been very important to me. I think what happens in the dream state is a state that's it's probably just a balancing for our waking state, which has been conditioned to believe in linear time and things like this. But in our dream state, we're immersed in the landscape. We're so immersed in it that everything in a dream, this is the way I experience it, is alive. It's numinous. It's vibrating. I'm not in a dream, a abstract observer observing over here. Mm-hmm. I think we have a tendency, and I can't say for certain because I'm just going from my own experience. So I would say even for myself, when I wake up, I might want to insert myself into the dream in a certain way that I really wasn't like that in the dream. I was just immersed in it. Mm-hmm. The dream consciousness is immersive. This is another way of being in the world. There are people that can be immersed in the world while they're awake. Those are close to enlightened people, actually, because they are not, it doesn't mean they can't utilize objective consciousness or logic when they need to, but they first feel the unfolding of nature through them, and then they only employ logic or abstract thought for limited purposes. This, I think, is the proper use of abstract thought. May I quote you one thing? My favorite quote in the world from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said, you first have he said all our progress is an unfolding. You first have an instinct, then an opinion, then a knowledge, as the tree is root, bud, and fruit. So trust your instinct to the end, though you can render no reason. It is vain to hurry it. By trusting it to the end, it shall ripen into truth, and you shall know why you believe.
That's what you mean by original thought.
That is what I mean by original thought, and that is what I mean by a successful marriage, a successful coming together of rational thought with intuition, gut instinct, because our guts, our instincts are what connect us to nature. We're too quickly jumping to the rational realm, forgetting what the ancient Greeks understood, that rational comes from ratio, or it's about proportion. It's about a living relationship between things. Mm-hmm. That's the real meaning of rational. And so there's nothing wrong with rational thought. In fact, it's very, very beautiful if it's in the right proportion. That's what the Greeks felt. I still feel that today. Yeah.
So when you use the phrase, as you do in your book title, original thinking, it has to do not with new thinking, but with being in touch with our origin. Yeah.
Well, it has more to do with origin as a place, because you talked about the dialogues that the former, I was the head of SEED Institute. Mm-hmm. We organized these dialogues with indigenous elders and Western linguists and Western scientists, primarily quantum physicists. Mm-hmm. And the very first question Leroy Lilber asked was, is it possible to come up with an original thought? And that's when, I realized that the very word original had two meanings.
Mm-hmm.
For the Western people in the room, including our mutual friend Moonhawk,
Mm-hmm.
tried to think of something brand new that had never been said before or done before,
Mm-hmm.
and he went right there.
Yeah.
And he went to try to think of something novel, which
Mm-hmm.
is a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Where the indigenous people took the question completely differently as an invitation to connect with original as origin. They went to the root of the word origin as a place, and a place of ever-present regeneration, or as grandfather Leon said, a place of original instructions for how to live on the planet. And that made a lot of sense to me.
Because they, as you say, they don't have a sense of linear time and a beginning. So origin isn't a static point in time.
That's right. If you ask the Hopi or something about their origin story, they're going to take you to the Little Colorado River. They're going to take you to a place. They're not going to be even the least bit concerned about what date that was. That's not important. What's important is the place where they emerged in their story, from another world underneath and came up into this world, which is as good a story as the Big Bang is just another story. Mm-hmm. It's a good story, but it's a story.
Mm-hmm. You also focus on what does it mean to be human?
Mm. Yes. Well, once we started to go down the path where we abstracted time, it was a very short distance to beginning to believe that human beings were defined by being abstract and defined by being separate. And we actually became proud of it. We became proud that we were separate from nature. We were proud that we didn't have to, meet at a certain time, or we didn't have to, we became kind of full of ourselves so much so that we build homes, right where there's going to be a flood, or we can conquer nature. Doesn't matter. We can do anything.
And there's the biblical belief that we have dominion over nature.
Yeah, that's a very complex one. I like to think that maybe in the best sense of it, dominion could imply caretaking, but it certainly hasn't played out that way, has it?
But it implies a separation.
Very much a separation and a superiority. So we're going to take care of, and we have been, doing. Intervening in the affairs of animals tremendously. I sometimes have funny conversations with people about this, where they'll tell me, I remember once when I had 2 kittens born in my own home. It was such a beautiful experience. And then I actually just happened to run across a woman who works in the animal humane movement or something, and I told her about this beautiful experience, and she gave me a lecture. She said, it's a zero-sum game. There's only so many animals. And I said, I had to say to her, well, wait a minute. Are we as human beings allowed to determine whether how all the other animals can give or not give birth? It's just a different way of looking at it. I know she was good-hearted, but I don't think that we necessarily are supposed to be determining that for other animals.
Yeah. Well, the very notion of eco-psychology, as popularized by Theodore Roszak and many other people now, is that we have to have a whole new sense of ourselves if we're ever going to get out of this ecological mess that we're creating. We're living in the midst of one of the world's great mass extinctions that we are creating.
I could not agree more. So in my opinion, the most important thing that has to shift is that we have to remember the source of our consciousness, which is the elements of life. We have to reconnect with them, and until we do that, we're going to continue to be othering the earth. And that's why we can drill for oil through water. But if we were thinking a little bit differently, if we were realizing we're 70% water, that water out there is us. We're connected to the water profoundly. We wouldn't be drilling for oil in it, would we? And that's what I've been blessed to learn from indigenous peoples, particularly like the Hopi,
that the body of the earth itself and the water is our body.
Well, yes. And our thoughts come from that. Here, I can almost prove it to you. I can't really prove it to you, but, in a Western sense. But look at the way we even speak about language. We speak about it as a stream of consciousness. Mm-hmm. We speak about mainstream thought. Yeah. We speak about underground thought. We speak about, or we depict, cartoonists depict thought as a cloud. We talk about people with their head in the clouds. Yeah. Now we want to save information on the cloud. What we want to have is a brainstorm, and all of that, all of those words, all of those supposed metaphors, I would submit to you, are not metaphors. It's actually the truth. That is how profoundly, intimately interconnected our consciousness is with the movement of water. See, we already know this about the tides, but it's also the hydrological cycle. We're connected with the movement of water because we are water beings. We're feeling that. And that's what I'm talking about with original thinking, is that connection to the source of our consciousness. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, it does, Glenn.
Thank you.
And you're really hitting the nail on the head, that this is a very profound understanding. I know your exposure to these indigenous ideas changed your life, and I hope it will help to influence the lives of our viewers by sharing this. Thank you so much for being with me.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Jeffrey. It's an honor.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your listings for part 2 of our 2-part series on the indigenous contribution to eco-psychology.